If one day your own family turns their back on you, where will you go? If everything you once believed to be home suddenly becomes the place that judges you most harshly, will you stand up for yourself or quietly leave to preserve your last shred of dignity? In the late 19th century, amidst the glamorous American East, Clara Whitmore, a woman of noble birth, was convicted by her own father overnight, fueled by rumors. No trial, no truth. Only a cold decision to put her on a ship to the west as a punishment called atonement. That western country didn't wait for her. No one cared who she used to be. No one asked what she had lost. In Redstone Valley, New Mexico, there was only dry land, hot winds, harsh labor, and a man of few words named Caleb Rourke. A cowboy who didn't ask about the past, didn't promise the future, only looked at how a person lived each day. Sent away as a burden, yet recognized as a human being. If it were you, would you run away when your past comes back to tarnish your reputation in front of a crowd, or would you stay quietly, proving your worth through hard work and integrity? This is not just the story of a woman in exile. This is the story of a man who realizes that what society considers punishment is sometimes the greatest gift of his life. If you believe that kindness, dignity, and resilience still have a place in this harsh world, stay with us and step into the story. Sent west as punishment, but the cowboy saw her as the greatest blessing of his life. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel to follow heartwarming stories where we cry in silence but rise stronger. Clara Whitmore once believed that honor was something that could not be taken away if one lived honestly and did nothing wrong. In Savannah, Georgia, where she was born and raised, girls were taught this from a very young age, along with how to sit up straight, how to lower their voices when speaking, and how to smile just enough so as not to be seen as arrogant. The Whitmore family was one of the oldest names in the city. Their white brick house nestled behind old oak trees, where each spring the fallen blossoms covered the pathway like a soft carpet. Clara grew up in that order. She wasn't the most striking person at afternoon teas or balls, but she was always described as a proper girl. Her gaze was calm, her voice never overslept. It was believed that such a girl would have a peaceful life, marry a worthy man, have children, and continue to uphold the family name as generations before her. Until that evening, the ball was held at the Bancrofts, a powerful, wealthy, and influential family in Southern politics. Clara arrived with her father, Edgar Whitmore, wearing the pale cream dress her mother had worn 20 years earlier. Her mother had long since passed away, but Clara kept the dress as a reminder of her modesty and self-respect. Little did she know that just hours later everything she believed in would shatter faster than a whisper. Julian Bancroft, the landlord's only son, was the first to invite Clara to dance. He had a charming smile and eyes, accustomed to receiving a response. When the music ended, Julian suggested Clara go to the back garden to get some fresh air. She hesitated, but politeness, something she had been taught instinctively, made her nod. There, amidst the late-blooming camellias, Julian had gotten too close. His voice trailed off his hands, no longer keeping their distance. Clara recoiled. She said no, clearly, not loudly but firmly. When Julian tried to grasp her wrist, Clara pulled away her eyes for the first time, devoid of any tenderness. She left the garden in silence, her heart pounding but her back straight. She believed that as long as she did nothing wrong, everything would be all right. Clara underestimated the speed at which rumors spread. Overnight, the story was twisted. People whispered that Clara had lost her composure, that she had seduced Julian, that something shady had happened in the Bancroft backyard. No one questioned Clara. No one needed the truth. Rumors need no proof, they just need a name to cling to. The next morning, as Clara went downstairs for breakfast, she found her father sitting there, the newspaper folded on the table. He didn't look at her immediately. When he did, his gaze was no longer that of a father but of someone weighing the pros and cons. Clara recounted everything. Slowly, without adding or subtracting anything. She spoke of the garden, of the handshake, of the rejection. Her voice trembled, but she didn't cry. She waited, not for comfort, but for trust. Edgar Whitmore remained silent for a long time. Then he said that the Bancroft family had sent a message of concern. that Julian was a young man with a future, that the town was small and rumors like that could ruin not just one person but an entire family. He didn't call Clara a liar. He just said that in matters like this the truth is often less important than the consequences. Clara stood there speechless. She understood at that moment that her father had made a choice, not between right and wrong but between his daughter and the name Whitmore. That evening Clara stayed in her room for a long time. She looked at the cream-colored dress hanging on the dresser. She looked at the gloves her mother used to wear. She didn't cry immediately. She just felt something inside her crumble, not loudly, not violently, but forever irreparably. There are families who will sacrifice their own flesh and blood to preserve their reputation, and Clara Whitmore became the price to pay. Clara didn't yet know that her father's silence in the room that morning wasn't the end of the fall but merely the first draft of a sentence that would change her entire life. After that morning, the Whitmore house became unusually quiet. Not the pleasant quiet of a well-ordered family but a heavy silence, as if every wall were listening and remembering. Clara was no longer invited to have tea with her father in the afternoons. There were no more polite questions about health or the weather. Everything went on in an orderly but cold manner, like a play in which her role had been erased from the script. 3 days later, Edgar Whitmore summoned Clara to his study. That room was where Clara used to sit and learn to read as a child. On the bookshelves were still old Bibles and family histories, meticulously recorded names, birth years, and death years. The afternoon light streamed through the tall window, casting a soft, pale yellow glow on her father's desk, gentle but not warm. Mr. Edgar did not invite her to sit. He stood by the window, his back straight, his hands clasped behind his back, a familiar posture he adopted whenever he was about to make a decision he considered necessary. "I've thought it through," he said, his voice even neither high nor low. "What just happened cannot be allowed to drag on." Clara stood still. She didn't ask, "What are you going to do, Father?" She had learned that in this room questions weren't always expected. Edgar turned around, his gaze serious but not angry. "In Savannah, you won't have another chance. Whether you were right or not, it doesn't matter anymore." He said it as if it were an obvious truth, just like talking about the weather or the price of cotton at the market. Then he offered a solution. He called it an opportunity. Clara will leave Savannah. Not immediately, but soon. She will be sent to the West, where new lands are in need of labor. A place where no one knows the name Whitmore. A place where, in his words, you can start over with your own hands. He didn't use the word exile. He didn't say punishment. He said atonement. "I need time to reflect," he said, "and this family needs time for things to calm down." Clara listened word for word as if they weren't being spoken to her but read from a pre-written verdict. She suddenly understood that this decision wasn't the result of the past few days. It had been formed the moment her father chose to remain silent in the face of the truth. "What did I do wrong?" Clara asked. Her voice wasn't shaky, but it was low. Edgar didn't answer directly. "Sometimes," he said, "it's not about whether you're wrong or not, but how you're perceived." That's when Clara realized that in her father's world, honor wasn't morality. Honor was social consensus. And when society turned its back, someone had to be pushed aside to keep that circle from breaking. Edgar went on to talk about the specific arrangements as if it were just a long trip, a temporary job. He would write a letter of recommendation, not for Clara but for those who would be hiring her. In the letter, he wouldn't mention the scandal, nor her family, just that she was a young woman who needed to learn to live simply. "I won't announce this," he said. "Everyone just needs to know that you're leaving for personal reasons." Clara understood what that meant. She would not say goodbye to anyone. No explanations. No maintaining any relationships that might cause Whitmore's name to be associated with hers. Those who had smiled at her at the parties would go on living their lives light and carefree. As for her, she will disappear. "I think this is good for you," Edgar said, and for the first time in that conversation his voice softened slightly. "There you'll learn the value of hard work, and perhaps you'll understand the consequences of your choices better." Clara didn't argue. She didn't plead, not because she agreed but because she understood that, in this moment, words were meaningless. The sentence had been pronounced, and the one pronouncing it was the person she had once trusted most. She left the study in silence. That evening, Clara sat alone in her room rearranging the few personal belongings she was allowed to bring. No jewelry, no ball gowns, just the essentials, as if her new life would need no trace of the past. In the hallway, she heard her father talking to a relative. He spoke of the situation being handled, of the right decision for the long-term benefit. Clara's name wasn't mentioned in the conversation. She was no longer an individual, she had become a problem that had been solved. There are wounds that don't come from beatings or harsh words. They come from rational coldness, from decisions made with a calm tone in the name of what is right. And Clara Whitmore understood that what hurt her most wasn't the social stigma, but the fact that when she needed someone to believe in her, her family chose to turn their backs on her. Honor, she realized, is a double-edged sword. It can protect a name and cut a person. A few days after that decision, as Clara Whitmore stepped down the steps of her familiar white brick house with a small suitcase in her hand, she didn't yet know what the West looked like, but she understood perfectly well that the upcoming train would not only take her away from Savannah but also away from the entire old life she had once thought was hers. Clara Whitmore's departure from Savannah that morning was unremarkable. No rain, no strong winds, clear skies, gentle sunshine, the kind of weather this eastern city proudly calls pleasant. But it was precisely this tranquility that made the moment of parting heavier, as if the world deliberately chose to ignore the fact that for one person, everything had just come to an end. Clara stepped out of her familiar white brick house in the early morning. The cobblestone path in front of the gate remained unchanged. The old oak trees still stood there, silent as unspoken witnesses. No one saw her off. No family, no friends, not a hug, not a word of farewell. The decision was orchestrated in this way, neat, discreet, leaving no lasting impact on Savannah's social life. Clara's suitcase was smaller than she had imagined. It contained a few simple clothes, a thin Bible, and permitted personal items. She hadn't brought a ball gown nor anything that reminded her of afternoon tea or formal parties. It was as if the new life awaiting her in the West had no place for symbols of her old identity. As Clara prepared to board the carriage to the station, Mrs. Halloway, the old maid who had worked for the Whitmore family for nearly 40 years, quietly approached. She said little. With trembling hands, she handed Clara a small cloth bundle, carefully tied with a worn string. "It's from your mother," she said softly. "She told me. If you ever have to go far away." Clara opened the cloth package once she was seated in the car. Inside was a simple, unadorned silver hair clip, the kind her mother usually wore when there were no guests. Clara clutched the item tightly in her hand. It was the only time that morning her throat tightened. The carriage departed, its wheels rolling along the familiar road, then turning toward the train station. Savannah receded behind little by little like a painting slowly being rolled up. Clara didn't look back. Not because she didn't regret it, but because she understood that there are places where once you've left in silence, turning back is meaningless. The train station was crowded, but Clara had never felt so alone. Families saying goodbye, men carrying heavy luggage, hurried farewells. It all happened around her, but it had nothing to do with her. No one knew who Clara Whitmore was, and no one needed to know. As the train whistled, preparing to depart, Clara boarded slowly. She chose a seat by the window. Outside, the eastern city went about as usual. There was nothing to suggest a life had just been split in two. The train began to move. Initially, Clara maintained her habit of sitting upright, hands neatly placed on her lap, her gaze fixed on the window, as if still at some solemn ceremony. But as Savannah faded into the distance and the scenery became more unfamiliar, the sprawling fields, the small towns, the deserted roads, she felt something within her loosen. Nobody on this train cared about the name Whitmore. The woman sitting opposite her asked a very simple question. "Where are you going?" "Redstone Valley," Clara replied. There were no scrutinizing glances, no follow-up questions. The name carried no social significance. It was simply a destination. On that long train journey, Clara began to realize a truth she had never faced in Savannah. Her old identity wasn't something she could take with her. It wasn't in her suitcase. It wasn't on her train ticket. And when no one knew it anymore, it gradually became invisible. The days on the train dragged on slowly. Morning, noon, and night blended together in the grinding sound of the iron wheels on the tracks. Clara observed everyone. The working men spoke little, the women carried small children, their eyes weary but accustomed to the constant movement. No one spoke of their past. No one boasted about their family. On this westward journey, the only thing they carried was the ability to keep going. At night, when the train carriage was bathed in the dim oil lamplight, Clara would often touch her mother's silver brooch. Not to remember Savannah, but to remind herself that though stripped of her name and social standing, she still had one thing left: her own dignity. She didn't know what Redstone Valley looked like. She didn't know what kind of work she would be doing, or how she would be treated. But during those long hours, gazing out the window into the darkness, Clara gradually understood that this train journey was more than just taking her far away geographically. It was teaching her how to survive without needing recognition. And as the train traveled further west, where the land became arid and the sky opened wider, Clara Whitmore began to feel very faintly, very vaguely, that perhaps her new life wouldn't ask her who she had been or what she had been. It would ask her only one thing: how much she could bear from today onward. As the final train came to a halt in the windswept, dusty landscape of Redstone Valley, Clara Whitmore stepped alight with a small suitcase, unaware that this place where no one bothered to inquire about her past would be her first test, the gateway to a completely different life. The Redstone Valley that appeared before Clara Whitmore was unlike any place she had ever known. There were no shady trees, no white-painted houses with wide porches and tall windows. Before her lay a barren valley stretching to the horizon, where earth and sky met in a dry, parched hue. The wind blew incessantly, carrying fine red dust that clung to her dress, her hair, even her breath. The sunlight wasn't harsh but persistent, a persistent sun that tired but didn't dazzle. Clara stepped onto the small platform of Redstone Valley, with only her suitcase in her hand. The platform had no large clock, no gleaming bulletin board. Just a rough wooden shelter, a few sun-darkened pillars, and a scattered group of people, sun-tanned faces, eyes accustomed to waiting and hardship. No one looked at Clara for longer than a breath. It wasn't that she wasn't different. On the contrary, her dress, though simpler than before, still had an Eastern flair. But in Redstone Valley, being different didn't pique curiosity. It only made people wonder, could she handle this place? A middle-aged man wearing a wide-brimmed hat approached. He didn't introduce himself. He only asked one question, his voice hoarse from the wind. Can she do the job? Clara blinked. The question wasn't rude, nor was it suspicious. It was as simple as asking about the weather or directions. But it was that very simplicity that made her pause. In Savannah, people asked her what family she belonged to. At parties, they asked what her father did for a living, where her mother came from. Her identity was built from questions like these. But here in Redstone Valley, they don't ask who she is. It's simply asked, what can she do? I can learn, Clara replied after a moment of silence. Her voice was low but clear. The man nodded as if that answer was sufficient. We need people. If you don't mind the hard work. No promises, no guarantees. Just a simple condition set between two strangers under the open sky. Clara followed him along the dirt road leading into the valley. On either side of the road were rows of low, hastily built but sturdy wooden houses. There was no decoration, nothing superfluous. Everything here served a single purpose: survival. She quickly realized that Redstone Valley had no time for pity. No one asked why she was there. No one was curious about her past. Not because they were kinder, but because they were too preoccupied with the present. Here, every day is a test. On the first afternoon, Clara was taken to a worker's dormitory. The room was small, with a wooden bed and coarse blankets. There was no large mirror, no dressing table. As she set down her suitcase, Clara suddenly realized, if she disappeared from the world now, no one in Savannah would know. And in Redstone Valley, no one would question it. The thought sent a chill down her spine, but strangely, it also brought a touch of relief. Late in the afternoon, the wind grew stronger. Red dust blanketed everything, blurring the colors. Clara stood at the door, gazing out at the valley, and for the first time she didn't feel watched by society's eyes. There were no whispers, no judgments, just the earth, the wind, and the silent space. Redstone Valley doesn't care about her downfall in the east. It doesn't know, and it doesn't need to know. Night fell quickly. The western sky was darker than Clara had imagined. There were no bright streetlights. Only scattered oil lamps cast a weak light. Clara sat on her bed, taking out her mother's silver brooch and holding it in her palm. In Savannah it was a memento. Here it was just a small object, worthless, unable to help her get food or a place to sleep. She suddenly understood what had once defined her had lost its function. The next day, Clara began her first job in Redstone Valley. No one gave lengthy explanations. No one provided detailed instructions. They simply showed her what to do and left her to figure it out. If she succeeded, she would stay. If not, she would leave. There is no room for weakness expressed verbally. Clara was clumsy. Her hands ached. Her back hurt. She wasn't used to the long hours of work from early morning until the sun was low in the sky. But what tired her most wasn't the work itself, it was the fact that no one cared about her feelings. In Savannah, every instance of fatigue is noticed. In Redstone Valley, fatigue is just a part of the day. And it was in that indifference that Clara began to sense something else, the raw fairness of this land. It wasn't biased, but neither was it prejudiced. It didn't ask who she had been. It simply gave her a chance the same as everyone else. The land doesn't care about your past, Clara thought, bending down to pick up the heavy items in the afternoon sun. Only what you can carry today. That statement wasn't meant as comfort. It was the truth. And for the first time since leaving Savannah, Clara Whitmore understood that if she wanted to survive here, she couldn't rely on any name. She would have to learn to shoulder the burden with her own hands and will. As the Redstone Valley sun set behind the barren hills, Clara Whitmore didn't know that in this land, that didn't bother to question the past, there would be a person who also chose silence, not to judge, but to observe her by a single measure the way she worked each day. Clara Whitmore met Caleb Rourke one early morning when the dew still clung low to the ground and the wind blew through the valley, carrying the scent of dry grass and red dust. It wasn't a planned or anticipated meeting. It happened as everything else in Redstone Valley happens, natural, simple, and without warning. Caleb Rourke stood by the eastern wooden fence of Rourke Ranch, checking the horse's tether. He was tall, sturdy, broad-shouldered, but not heavy. His hair was streaked with gray, his face tanned, and deep wrinkles etched around his eyes, signs of years spent outdoors rather than of age. When Clara approached following the instructions of another worker, he only lifted his head just enough to look at her. That gaze wasn't scrutinizing, not cold-hearted. It's just a familiar perspective on judging by facts. "Are you new here?" he asked. "Yes," Clara replied. Her voice was slightly strained, as if she were still unaccustomed to standing before a Western man without any social pretense to protect herself. Caleb nodded. He asked no further questions. No questions about where she was from. No questions about why a young woman still with a distinctly Eastern appearance was in Redstone Valley. He simply looked down at her hands, slender but not trembling, then at the small old suitcase beside her. "Here we work from sunrise," he said, his voice low and slow. "It's not easy, it's not light, but it's fair." Clara waited for a follow-up question, a comment, some curiosity about her past. But Caleb Rourke added only one more sentence, brief, as if that were the only thing he needed to say to any newcomer. "If you work honestly, you'll stay. There are no promises of protection, no words of comfort, but neither is there doubt or judgment. That statement is non-negotiable. It is a principle applied to all without exception." Clara quickly realized that for Caleb Rourke, people weren't defined by the stories they told about themselves, but by how they showed up each day on time and did their part. Caleb led Clara around the ranch. Rourke Ranch wasn't large by Eastern standards, but in the Redstone Valley, it was one of the most well-established. Everything was neatly organized, nothing superfluous. The stables were clean, tools were hung in their proper places. There was nothing ostentatious. "We don't ask about the past," Caleb said, stopping in front of the workers' quarters. "Everyone who comes here carries something on their back. But if you keep looking back, nobody can get the job done." The statement was uttered softly, without any philosophical undertones. It was more like an observation drawn from years of observing people, understandable enough, but requiring no further explanation. Clara listened, not with her ears, but with the caution of someone who had been hurt by seemingly harmless questions. In Savannah they asked to categorize. Here Caleb didn't ask, and that made Clara feel safe in a very different way. In the days that followed, Clara worked under Caleb's indirect supervision. He didn't stand beside her to point fingers. He observed from a distance. When she made a mistake, he corrected her, without raising his voice, without scolding. When she did it right, he nodded. That was enough. Caleb wasn't a man of many words. He rarely spoke about himself. Long-time employees said he had lost his wife in a harsh winter many years ago. Some said he had been a wandering cattle herder before settling in Redstone Valley. But Caleb never confirmed or denied it. He kept his past to himself just as he allowed others to keep theirs. Clara realized that being near Caleb Rourke, she didn't need to explain who she was. And that for her was a profound relief. On some afternoons when work had calmed down, Clara would see Caleb standing alone gazing out at the valley. His eyes were distant but not melancholic, like someone who had accepted what life offered without needing to complain. Clara never approached him at those times. She understood that respect in the West sometimes meant keeping a distance. Caleb did the same. He didn't ask Clara about Savannah. He didn't ask about the Whitmore family. He didn't ask why a woman like her had chosen Redstone Valley. But he noticed other things, how she arrived a few minutes earlier each morning, how she persevered through her work despite the pain in her hands, how she didn't complain when things got harder than expected. For Caleb Rourke, that's the answer. In the West, people aren't judged by their words, they are judged by their presence. And Clara began to understand that in Caleb's quiet reserve, there was a kind of kindness, very characteristic of old generation Western men, not ostentatious, not saving anyone, but always making room for those willing to do good. One evening, as the sun had set and the wind grew colder, Clara unexpectedly came across Caleb, repairing a broken section of fence. She offered to help. Caleb looked at her, then handed her a hammer. No explanation. No suspicion. She worked slowly, but carefully. When she finished, Caleb nodded. Good. Just one word. But for Clara, it carried more weight than any compliment she had ever received in her life before. In that moment, Clara Whitmore understood that this man would never ask her where she came from, but he would know very well what kind of person she was through each day she chose to stay and work honestly. And for the first time since leaving Savannah, Clara felt that perhaps her past no longer had the power to determine her future. But Clara Whitmore didn't know that Caleb Rourke's calmness and fairness were just the first step, because on her very first official day at Rourke Ranch, the land would test her in a much rougher way, enough to break anyone unprepared to stay. Clara Whitmore's first official day of work at Rourke Ranch began before the sun had even risen above the horizon. The alarm clock didn't ring, no one called. Clara woke up out of a habit she'd formed in her early days in Redstone Valley, the habit of someone who knew that if she didn't get up herself, no one else would. The morning air was cold and dry. The wooden floor beneath her bare feet was so hard and cold that she had to take a deep breath before stepping down. She wore the rough work dress she'd been given the day before, her hair neatly tied back as she used to in Savannah, except now there was no large mirror to adjust each strand. When Clara stepped outside the Redstone Valley, sky was still a pale gray, and the wind carried the scent of dry grass and ash from the valley. The kitchen at Rourke Ranch was lit up. Missus Eleanor Pike stood in the middle of the spacious kitchen, back straight, hands clasped behind her apron. She was a much older woman than Clara, her gray hair neatly tied back, her face serious as if accustomed to keeping her emotions hidden. Her eyes were sharp and alert, the eyes of someone who had done this work too long to have any patience for clumsiness. "You're 3 minutes late," Mrs. Pike said, without looking up at Clara. Clara froze. She looked at the clock on the wall, an old slow clock but clearly past the start of the workday. She opened her mouth to apologize but then stopped herself. "Excuse me, ma'am," she said, her voice low. Mrs. Pike didn't answer. She simply handed Clara a bucket of water and a stack of cloths. "Wash the floors. From the back door to the main kitchen. When you're finished, come back here." No explanation, no further instructions. That's how the work begins. The kitchen floor was cold, damp, and greasy. Clara bent down, dipped a cloth into the bucket of water and began to wipe. Her back quickly ached. Her knees scraped against the rough wood floor, causing her skin to sting. She had never done this for so long. In Savannah, cleaning was something done in silence by others, people Clara had never had to think about. Now she's the one bending down. Each time Clara slowed down, Mrs. Pike walked past saying nothing, but her gaze was enough to make Clara understand that here no one was waiting for her to adapt. After mopping the floor, Clara was assigned the task of washing the pots. The pots were large, heavy, and covered in food residue. The cold water numbed her hands. When she tried to lift one, it slipped from her grasp, crashing loudly onto the floor with a resounding bang that echoed throughout the kitchen. Mrs. Pike turned around. Her eyes held no anger. They were simply disappointed. "Here," she said slowly, "we don't have time for sloppiness." Clara bent down to pick up the pot, her hands trembling. Her cheeks burned, not from being scolded but from a gnawing sense of humiliation, a feeling she thought she had left behind in the East. She wanted to explain that her hand hurt, that she wasn't used to it, but the words got stuck in her throat. She understood that at Rourke Ranch, explanations wouldn't make the work any easier. Mid-morning, as Clara was chopping vegetables for lunch, the knife slipped, cutting her fingertip. Blood trickled out a bright red against her skin, pale from the cold. She gritted her teeth, wrapped a towel around the wound, and continued working. Mrs. Pike saw it. She didn't tell Clara to stop. She simply pushed a bottle of antiseptic towards her. "We'll bandage it up when the time is up," she said. The pain throbbed with each breath. Clara's back stiffened. Her shoulders felt heavy. Every movement became slower. At noon, when the meal was served to the workers, Clara stood huddled in a corner, her hands trembling as she carried her tray of food. A few eyes were on her, not malicious, but curious. A woman whispered something to the person next to her. Clara couldn't hear clearly, but she understood the feeling of being watched, judged in silence. It wasn't much different from Savannah, only here there were no silk dresses or formal gowns to conceal it. After lunch, the work continued. No rest, no slowing down. By mid-afternoon, Clara felt as if her body no longer belonged to her. Her head was spinning, her hands ached. Every step required effort. There was a moment when Clara stood alone behind the kitchen counter, the wind blowing through the door, carrying red dust, and she thought about leaving. Just put the towel down. Just say you can't take it anymore. Nobody here knows who you are. Nobody expects anything from you. The thought came to her very subtly but clearly enough to make her heart ache. Then Clara remembered Savannah. She remembered her father's cold study. She remembered the sentence called opportunity. She remembered the long train ride and the silence of the people who didn't ask any questions. She understood that if she left today, she would carry this feeling of failure with her wherever she went. And Clara Whitmore decided to stay. She didn't straighten her back. She didn't miraculously work faster. She just kept going, one task at a time, one small movement 1 minute at a time. As dusk fell, her hands were bleeding, and her back ached so much that each time she bent down, she had to grit her teeth. When Mrs. Pike announced the end of the workday, Clara could barely stand. Mrs. Pike looked at her one last time that day. No smile, no compliment. But he didn't tell her to leave either. That night, Clara sat on her bed in her small room, removing the bandage from her arm and washing the wound with cold water. Tears fell very softly without a sound. Not from pain, but from exhaustion. But the next morning before dawn, Clara Whitmore sat up again. And it was in those quiet mornings when no one saw, no one praised, that Clara Whitmore began to understand that giving up is easy, but staying quietly and persistently is what truly tests a person. No 2 days at Rourke Ranch were exactly alike, but for Clara Whitmore the first few weeks passed in a state where it was almost impossible to distinguish between day and night. Every morning she woke up before the light reached the small window. No alarm, no one to call her. Her body ached so much that even sitting up took a few seconds to catch her breath, but Clara still put her feet on the floor one step at a time, as if it were the most natural thing to do. In Redstone Valley, waking up on time wasn't a virtue, it was a condition for survival. Clara has had more failures than successes. She spilled water while carrying a bucket. She burned the pot while lost in thought. She cut vegetables unevenly, causing Mrs. Pike to silently correct her. On some days, everything she touched seemed clumsy, as if her hands wouldn't obey her. These failures weren't met with loud reprimands. They were acknowledged with silence, a silence heavier than any reprimand. Clara's hands were constantly bleeding. Small scratches piled up, and before they could heal, they were torn open again by her work. Her back ached constantly, especially when she bent down for long periods. Some nights, when she lay down in bed, Clara felt her body heavy, as if it no longer belonged to her. And then the tears came. Not in broad daylight. Not in front of anyone. Clara's tears fell at night very softly, when the only sound in the small room was the wind whistling through the cracks in the door. She cried silently, not from mere pain but from exhaustion. Exhausted from constantly trying and still not feeling any better. Exhausted because each day felt like a test she was never prepared for. There were nights when Clara would lie staring at the rough wooden ceiling thinking about leaving. The thought wasn't loud. It came softly like a reasonable suggestion, that perhaps she'd tried enough. That no one in Savannah knew she was here. That if she left Redstone Valley she could find somewhere else a gentler, less harsh place. But every morning Clara still woke up on time. Not because of hope, not because of eloquent determination, but because of one very simple thing: it's easier to stay today than to face the feeling of giving up forever. Caleb Rourke said nothing about Clara's failures. He saw them, of course he did, but he didn't intervene unless necessary. For him, people weren't judged by one bad day. They were judged by whether they came back the next day. Mrs. Pike was the same. She wasn't any gentler, but neither was she any harsher. She assigned tasks, observed, corrected mistakes, and then assigned more. This regularity initially struck Clara as cold, but gradually she understood it was how they were giving her a chance. The other workers began to get used to Clara's presence. No one praised her. No one comforted her. But no one chased her away either. Sometimes a handkerchief was placed a little closer, a brief reminder when she was about to make a mistake. These small gestures weren't friendliness, they were acceptance in the making. One afternoon, Clara dropped the tray of freshly washed dishes. The sound of shattering echoed through the kitchen. She froze, her heart pounding, waiting. "Mrs." Pike turned around and looked at the broken pieces of porcelain on the floor. "Move out," she said. "That's all." Clara bent down, her hands trembling, and began picking up the pieces. No one helped. No one blamed her. And in that very moment Clara understood that mistakes weren't what eliminated people in this place. Only giving up could do that. That night Clara cried again. But the tears were different. They were no longer purely tears of despair. They were the release of a body and spirit that had been burdened with more than ever before. And then the next morning Clara woke up again. She didn't get any better immediately, but she started spilling less water, hurting her hands less. Her steps were steadier when carrying heavy things. The changes were so small that you wouldn't notice them unless you were paying close attention. But Clara noticed, and that was enough. In Redstone Valley, no one applauds quiet effort. But it is precisely that silence that creates the space for character to be formed. Character is built when no one is watching. Clara Whitmore didn't read that quote somewhere. She lived in it. No one saw her when she sat up straight amidst her back pain. No one saw her when she bandaged her hand in the dim light. No one saw the moments she wanted to leave and then didn't. But as the days went by, Redstone Valley acknowledged her presence in its own way. Not with praise, not with tenderness, but by allowing her to continue to stay. And in that staying, Clara Whitmore, once defined by her family's fame and the rumors surrounding her, is gradually being redefined by something else: resilience. It was during those unnoticed days when failure repeated itself, when there was no encouragement, that Clara Whitmore began to change in the quietest yet most enduring way, just as the Redstone Valley soil gradually bears the footprints of those patient enough to stay. Clara Whitmore's transformation didn't happen overnight, nor was it linked to any momentous event. It wasn't marked by a declaration or a firm resolve. If someone were to ask Clara exactly when she started to change, she probably wouldn't be able to answer. At Rourke Ranch, change doesn't happen with a sound. It happens in silence, like how dry soil in the Redstone Valley gradually softens after days of rain so slowly that you only notice it when you bend down and touch it. Clara began to learn the rhythm of work. No longer were her movements awkward and exhausting as she struggled with the task. She gradually understood when to slow down and when to exert herself. She learned to regulate her breathing when lifting heavy objects, how to position her hands to prevent slipping, and how to stand tall instead of unconsciously hunching over. These small things weren't taught verbally, they were passed down through observation and through repeated mistakes that her body naturally learned. In the morning, Clara no longer woke up with a start. She opened her eyes, before she even thought about opening them. Her body knew it was time to get up. Her hands still ached, but the pain no longer frightened her. It had become a part of the day, like the wind, like the dust, like the persistent sunlight. Mrs. Eleanor Pike was the first to notice that change. Not through words, but through the fact that she no longer had to correct Clara's hands as much as before. The vegetables were chopped more evenly. The pots were placed down more gently. The kitchen was still noisy and harsh, but Clara was no longer out of sync with it. She was beginning to blend in with the rhythm, not outstanding, but not out of place either. One lunchtime, as Clara was carrying her tray of food outside Mrs. Pike simply said, "Put it on the east table. No further explanation is needed. No further verification required." For Mrs. Pike, it was a form of trust, dry, few words, but true. Clara also began to change the way she saw things around her. Previously, her gaze often held a sense of reserve, as if always awaiting judgment. Now that gaze has become more resolute. She looks directly at the work before her. She looks at the other workers without feeling out of place. She sees Redstone Valley not as a place of exile, but as a space where she needs to learn to exist. She no longer thought about Savannah every day. Not because the memories had faded, but because the present was enough to occupy her mind completely. In the afternoons, as the sun set, Clara stood on the kitchen porch watching her shadow stretch across the red earth. She noticed that her figure had changed shoulders, stronger steps, more confident. Gone was the timid gait of a young lady from the east, hesitant to get her dress dirty. In Redstone Valley, there are no dresses or skirts to keep clean. Only hands and willpower remain. Caleb Rourke noticed the change, though he never said it out loud. He realized Clara no longer needed prompting. No longer flustered by new tasks, no unnecessary questions, no lengthy explanations. She simply nodded and got to work. For Caleb, that was the clearest sign that someone had begun to belong here. On some afternoons, he would see Clara standing with the other workers, repairing the fence or tidying the storeroom. She didn't stand apart. She didn't shy away. Nor did she try to prove anything. Her presence felt natural, as if she had always been there. The most profound changes occurred within Clara, where no one could see them. She no longer measures her self-worth by whether or not she receives attention, no longer waits for recognition. With each passing day, simply completing her work is enough to make her feel useful. It's a new feeling, quiet but steadfast. During the long nights, Clara would still sometimes wake up with back pain or aching arms. But she no longer cried as she used to. She lay still, breathing evenly, waiting for the pain to pass, as if it were a familiar guest whose appearance didn't need to be panicked about. She began to smile more often, not the polite social smiles she'd learned in Savannah, but rather subtle smiles that appeared when things went smoothly, when the day ended without major mishaps. No one at Rourke Ranch complimented Clara on how much she had changed, but people began to treat her as part of the common good. A seat was reserved for her. A reminder when it was about to rain, a nod of approval when the work was finished. These little things weren't affections, they were signs of acknowledgement. And Clara understood that in Redstone Valley, acceptance doesn't come with words, it comes with no more questioning. One morning, Clara inadvertently caught a glimpse of her reflection in the frosted kitchen window. Her face was thinner. Her skin was tanned by the sun and wind. But her eyes, those eyes were different, no longer evasive, no longer fearful. They held the serenity of someone who knew she could endure. She is no longer the woman sent away to atone for her sins. She is a person who is living, working, and staying. That change didn't make Clara tougher in a harsh way. On the contrary, it softened her from within. She learned to accept herself in her imperfect state. She learned that a person's value lies not in where they come from, but in how they present themselves each day. Redstone Valley did not applaud Clara's transformation, but every inch of this land is silently remembering her footsteps. And when that quiet change is prolonged and sustained enough, Clara Whitmore is about to realize that in the Redstone Valley there are things that cannot be asked for, cannot be given, but can only be earned through time and hard work, and one of them is respect. Respect in Redstone Valley doesn't come on a specific day that one can remember. It's not declared, it's not given, and it certainly isn't asked for. It arrives very slowly, so slowly that unless you've lived long enough in the harsh rhythm of Rourke Ranch, you won't realize when you've got it in your hands. For Clara Whitmore, the first moment of change wasn't when someone complimented her. It was when Mrs. Eleanor Pike was no longer standing behind her. One morning, Clara was preparing breakfast as usual. The kitchen was noisy, with the clanging of knives and cutting boards, the banging of pots against the stove, and the whistling of the wind through the cracks in the door. Previously, whenever Clara worked, Mrs. Pike would always stand nearby, not to help, but to be ready to correct her. But that morning, Clara noticed she was at the other end of the kitchen, her back turned, doing her own thing. No one said anything, but Clara knew. Miss Pike believed that she wouldn't mess things up without supervision. That trust wasn't gentle. It was dry, like adding another log to a fire, knowing the flames won't go out. But for Clara, it was a turning point. From that day on, small changes continued to take place. Mrs. Pike began assigning Clara more important tasks, not out of pity but because she needed someone capable. When she was short of staff, she called Clara by name, naturally, without a scrutinizing glance. When there was an urgent task, she didn't ask, "Can you do it?" but simply said, "Clara, do this." In Redstone Valley, calling someone by their first name at work is a form of recognition. The other employees also began to change the way they viewed Clara. Before, they had seen her as a temporary presence, an Eastern woman who might leave at any moment. Now their gazes were more neutral, no longer curious, no longer scrutinizing. Clara was no longer the subject of whispers. She became part of the system. When heavy work required extra help, someone would call her. When there was a shortage of workers, someone would wait for her. No one praised her for being skilled, but no one doubted that she would do her part. And most importantly, no one is defending Clara anymore. It's not that she doesn't need protection, but that she's no longer in a position to be protected. Caleb Rourke saw that most clearly. He didn't intervene when the employees began treating Clara as an equal. He didn't need to tell anyone what Clara had proven. At Rourke Ranch, things like that didn't need to be said. They were understood. One afternoon, when work finished earlier than usual, Clara sat resting on the steps behind the kitchen. A worker placed a glass of water beside her without saying a word. It was a small gesture, but Clara understood its meaning. She no longer has to stand in the corner. She has found her place. That respect didn't make Clara proud. On the contrary, it made her more humble. She understood that in Redstone Valley, respect wasn't a title to be held onto forever. It could be lost if people stopped showing up, stopped working, or started thinking they deserved it without trying anymore. So Clara continued working as before. No more, no less. She didn't mention the past. She didn't tell her life story. She didn't explain why she was there. She let her work speak for herself. Every morning she arrived on time. Every task was completed thoroughly. Every mistake was corrected without excuse. One day, when a new servant arrived, he looked at Clara with that familiar look of suspicion, the same look she'd seen on the train during her early days in Redstone Valley. Before Clara could say anything, Mrs. Pike spoke up. "She knows about it." Just 4 words, but enough. Clara didn't turn to look at Mrs. Pike. She continued with her work. But inwardly, something quietly settled, not an outburst of joy, but the peace of someone who knew they had stood firm. That evening, Clara sat alone, polishing her worn work shoes. She thought about Savannah, about the parties where people smiled and judged each other with just a glance. Their respect was tied to names, family, and things one didn't have to do oneself. Here in Redstone Valley, we don't care about those things. Respect is never given. It's earned quietly. Clara didn't read that quote anywhere. She lived with it day after day. And what made her realize she had truly changed wasn't how others saw her, but that she no longer needed anyone to defend her, to feel valued. If someone speaks ill of her, she doesn't defend herself. If someone doubts her, she doesn't argue. She lets time and work provide the answers. In Redstone Valley, that's the only way. Caleb Rourke once said that people don't belong until they no longer have to prove they do. Clara understood that saying later, but when she did, she knew it was true. One afternoon, as the sunlight streamed across the valley, Clara stood watching Rourke Ranch operate around her, the kitchen, the stables, the granary. She wasn't standing outside anymore. She was inside it. And it was in that moment that Clara Whitmore realized that the respect she had earned didn't make her greater than anyone else, but it made her stand taller, not because she was being supported, but because she had finally learned to lift herself up. When Clara Whitmore no longer needed to prove who she was among the people of Redstone Valley, someone had quietly recognized that long ago, and it was from that silent respect that a slow, wordless bond began to form. Caleb Rourke has never been one to stare at someone for too long. In Redstone Valley, staring is often accompanied by judgment, scrutiny, or suspicion. Caleb didn't have that habit. He observed people differently from a distance for long enough and without interfering. He believed that only when unpressured would a person's true nature be revealed. And that's what Clara Whitmore observed, not from the first day she arrived at Rourke Ranch. Back then, Clara was just one of many who came and went, people with their own stories, often disappearing before the land could even remember their names. Caleb didn't invest his attention in those who hadn't proven they would stay. But Clara stayed. Caleb began to notice her presence in a very special way, not through words, but through rhythm. A rhythm that arrived on time, a rhythm that worked quietly, a rhythm that didn't complain, didn't grumble. Gradually, that presence became familiar, like a part of the morning of the sunlight spreading across the valley of the steady footsteps on the red earth. Caleb didn't flirt with Clara, nor did he try to get close to her. There were no lengthy conversations between them, no personal questions. When he spoke, Caleb only said what needed to be said about work, the weather, the tasks for the day. His voice was low, slow, and never hurried. But Clara realized that he always knew where she was. Not in a controlling way, but in the way of someone in charge, someone who needs to know how the farm is running. If Clara didn't show up in the morning, Caleb would ask Mrs. Pike, not with excessive anxiety, just a necessary question. And when Clara did a good job, Caleb didn't praise her. He just gave her more work as if that were the most natural way of saying he believed she could handle more. Silent trust developed between them. On some afternoons when work had calmed down, Clara would see Caleb standing at a distance, gazing toward the stables or the fields. His eyes weren't directly on her, but Clara knew he saw her working, and that didn't make her nervous. On the contrary, it made her feel more secure, as if someone was silently acknowledging her presence without saying a word. Caleb also noticed subtle changes in Clara, changes that only those who have observed her long enough would notice. Her gait was no longer hesitant. Her way of putting things down was no longer hurried. The way she looked at others without avoidance, without defensiveness. It wasn't ostentatious confidence. It was the inner peace of someone who had found a rhythm in life that suited her. One morning when it was drizzling, a rare occurrence in Redstone Valley, Caleb saw Clara standing and shielding a corner of the shed to prevent water from flooding in. She did it without being asked. When Caleb approached, she simply nodded in greeting and continued with her task. Caleb said nothing. But deep down he knew this was no longer just a temporary resident. Their bond wasn't forged in romantic moments. It had no explosive point, no lingering gazes or half-spoken words. It was more like two people working together on a plot of land, each understanding their part and trusting that the other will complete the rest. Once a new employee at Rourke Ranch inadvertently made a disrespectful remark about Clara, not malicious, just ignorant. Caleb heard it. He didn't react harshly. He simply said one short, even sentence, "She is one of us." No further explanation needed. No further explanation is needed. Clara didn't hear the remark, but its impact spread in its own way. From that day on, no one questioned her place at Rourke Ranch anymore. And most importantly, Caleb never asked Clara about her past. It wasn't because he wasn't curious. Rather, he believed that what was worth knowing about a person had already been sufficiently revealed in how they lived in the present. The past, if it needed to be spoken of, would find its own time. Forcing it to reappear would only further wound what was already broken. That very silence created a strangely safe space for Clara. Being around Caleb, she didn't feel the need to explain, justify, or recount her life story to be understood. She just needed to be herself, a hard-working, independent person standing on her own 2 feet. On those rare evenings when work ended late, Clara and Caleb would stand together watching the sun set behind the distant hills. They said nothing. The silence between them felt natural. It was like an unspoken agreement. Not every connection needs words. Caleb never made any promises to Clara, nor did he give any indication that he expected anything more than her continuing to do her job well. But Clara sensed one thing very clearly: he believed in her. And for a woman who has been abandoned by her own family, that trust is worth more than any declaration of love. That quiet connection didn't make Clara dream. It didn't make her heart flutter in the way of the romantic stories she'd heard when she was young. But it brought a different feeling, deeper, slower, and more enduring. She didn't need to be someone else to be recognized. She didn't need to please anyone. She didn't need to appear weaker or stronger than she truly was. With Caleb Rourke, Clara Whitmore was allowed to simply be herself, living life to the fullest. And perhaps it is in that very stillness that something is growing, not noisy, not hurried, like a seed lying deep in the soil of Redstone Valley, waiting for enough time and challenges to emerge into the light. But before that bond could even be named, Redstone Valley, like the small communities on the frontier, was about to remind Clara Whitmore that the past never disappears completely. It just quietly waits for an opportunity to return, often when people think they are strong enough. The Redstone Valley Autumn Festival is one of the few occasions when this small town allows itself to slow down. There were no fireworks or grand performances like in the East. The festival here consisted of just a few makeshift stalls, long wooden tables set in a red earth square, the uneven sound of an old fiddle, and the smell of hot food mingling in the dry evening breeze. But for people who spent the whole year working and remaining silent, that was enough to call it a special day. Clara Whitmore hesitated for a long time before deciding to attend. No one forced her to go. Mrs. Pike had simply said that the kitchen would close earlier than usual. Some of the staff mentioned the festival as a matter of routine to show up, have a different meal than usual, and then go home early. Caleb Rourke said nothing. He simply asked Clara if she wanted to go with everyone in the same neutral tone as when he asked about work. Clara nodded. She wasn't sure she wanted to go, but a part of her understood that if she truly belonged in the Redstone Valley, sooner or later she had to stand in the middle of the town as a member of the community, not on the sidelines. That afternoon, Clara changed out of her work dress into a simpler outfit, yet one still familiar to the American way of life. No makeup, no jewelry, except for a small silver brooch her mother had given her, tucked neatly in her hair, something she still kept as a silent anchor. As she stepped outside, a gentle breeze blew, carrying the scent of earth and dry grass, making her feel unusually heavy-hearted. Redstone Valley Square was busier than usual. People laughed, shook hands, and called each other by name. The familiar faces of Rourke Ranch appeared in a different context, less serious, less hurried. Clara walked with the group of workers, slowly observing rather than participating. Initially, everything went normally. Some people greeted her with a familiar nod. Others inquired about her work. It wasn't overly familiar, but enough for Clara to feel like an outsider. She stood by the food table, helping to clear it out of habit, even though no one asked her to. These small actions had become a part of her, so natural that she no longer realized it. Then the past speaks. Not with a direct accusation, not with shouting or public humiliation. It came back in a more cruel way, with whispers. Clara didn't hear the first sentence. She only sensed a change in the air, an unusually brief silence, a fleeting glance that lingered for too long, a hasty turning of the head as she approached. Then she heard her name very softly. Whitmore. That name didn't belong in Redstone Valley. It carried the scent of the East, of brightly lit drawing rooms, of parties and gossip. Clara stood still for a brief moment, her heart skipping a beat. A stranger standing near the liquor store, perhaps a merchant passing through town, was talking to a local. His voice wasn't loud, but it was clear enough. "I've heard that name in Savannah," he said. "It's not a good story." Clara didn't listen to the rest. There was no need to. She was all too familiar with how the story was told, different each time, but always the same conclusion: she was the suspect. The past is not dead. It's just waiting for the right moment. Clara felt her throat dry up. Not from fear, like before, but from a familiar feeling, the feeling of being placed back in a position from which she had taken so long to escape. What could she say? Defend herself? Explain? Tell the truth? She'd done it before, in Savannah, and she knew the result. Clara stood still. She didn't leave. She didn't move forward. She let the whispers pass through her like wind through a valley, unstoppable, yet also unstoppable. Her face was so serene that even she was surprised. Her hands didn't tremble. Her back remained straight. A few eyes turned toward her. Some gazes held curiosity. Others carried an unformed prejudice. But no one directly confronted her. This humiliation is not public. It is insidious, and that is precisely why it is more dangerous. Caleb Rourke stood at the edge of the square, talking to an acquaintance. He couldn't hear the whispers, but he noticed the change in Clara's face. He saw her stand still longer than usual. He saw her eyes become closed like a door just slammed shut from the inside. He didn't approach immediately. Caleb understood that some battles couldn't be resolved by immediate intervention, and he also knew Clara wouldn't want to be rescued. Mrs. Pike sensed something was wrong, too. She looked at Clara, then at the groups of people whispering. Her gaze sharpened, but she said nothing. In Redstone Valley, women like her understood perfectly. Rumors need no proof. They just need ground to fall into. Clara took a deep breath. She didn't leave early. She didn't look for a place to hide. She stayed until the festival ended as originally planned. When someone looked at her, she nodded in greeting as usual. When no one was looking, she didn't reveal anything. But inside, the old cracks are stirring. That evening, as Redstone Valley returned to its familiar silence, Clara walked alone toward Rourke Ranch. The night wind was colder, carrying fine dust that clung to her dress. She didn't cry. Not now. She knew exactly what had just happened. The past has found its way back. And this time it wasn't just challenging her, it was challenging her place in this community. Clara paused for a moment, gazing at the scattered lights of the town behind her. She didn't regret attending the festival. She just understood that the journey to healing was never a straight line. There are paths one must walk again, not because they are weak, but because life wants to know how strong they truly are. And Clara Whitmore didn't realize that the whispers of the night were just the prelude, because very soon the past would no longer hide behind the crowd, but would step straight into the light, forcing her to confront public humiliation in the very community she had devoted herself to. Redstone Valley is not a place accustomed to noisy scenes. This small town rarely witnesses open conflict. People here live close together, work side by side, and understand very well that words once spoken in a crowd never disappear. Therefore, they often choose silence. But precisely because of this, when the silence is broken, the consequences are far more severe than any shouting. The incident occurred late one morning, a few days after the festival. Clara Whitmore was sent to town to deliver some supplies to the general store, a routine, unremarkable job. She had done this many times before. The dirt road leading into the center of Redstone Valley was so familiar she could walk it without looking. The small square was quite crowded at that time. It wasn't a festival, but it wasn't deserted either. A few people stopped to chat. A few were buying and selling. The sound of horse hooves mingled with the scattered conversations. The atmosphere seemed completely normal, until a voice rang out, not too loud, but loud enough to cut through all other sounds. "Do you think you can pretend to be a decent person here?" Clara stopped. She turned her head very slowly. The man standing near the department store's doorstep was the same stranger from the festival the day before. He wasn't shouting. He wasn't angry. His voice carried something far more unsettling, the confidence of someone who believed they were speaking the truth. "In the East," he continued, "people know what kind of person she is." No one spoke up. No one intervened. The people around turned to look. Some eyes widened. Some lowered their gazes. Not everyone believed him. But that didn't matter. What mattered was the words had been spoken in broad daylight in front of everyone. Clara Whitmore stood still. She didn't ask, "What are you talking about?" She didn't ask for proof. She didn't argue. And she didn't turn away either. That moment lasted a very long time. The wind blew across the square, carrying red dust that brushed against the hem of her dress. Clara could feel her heartbeat steady, slow, and not panicked. She realized that what hurt her most wasn't the insult but the familiarity of this situation. She stood like this before. In Savannah, amidst scrutinizing glances and unproven rumors. That day she tried to speak. She said nothing today. Clara held her back straight. Her arms hung loosely by her sides. Her gaze neither avoided the man before her, nor challenged him. It wasn't the look of resignation but the look of someone who understood that some words weren't worth a reply. The man seemed bewildered by her reaction. He expected panic, denial, tears, but Clara gave him none of that. The silence began to grow heavy. Some people around shifted visibly uncomfortable. Some turned away. Some looked down at the ground. Not because they felt sorry for Clara but because they realized the scene was crossing the line of mere curiosity. Clara took another step. Just one step, not to leave, but to stand stronger. She said nothing. She offered no explanation. She didn't ask anyone to believe her. And it was that silence, resolute, unwavering, that changed the atmosphere. The man repeated something but his voice had lost its initial certainty. No one responded. No one echoed his words. He stood there, suddenly out of place, like someone who had carried an old story to a place no longer willing to listen. Clara turned away. She walked toward the store, completing the delivery as if nothing had happened. The store owner, an elderly man, received the goods in silence, his gaze lingering on Clara's face longer than usual. He offered no apology, no comfort. But as Clara turned her back, he whispered, "Just leave the goods here." His voice was deep, decisive. That's how he chooses which side to take. As Clara stepped out of the shop, the square fell silent, no voices directed at her. People dispersed. Business resumed. But the traces of that moment remained quiet, not fading away. On the way back to Rourke Ranch, Clara felt her legs heavier than usual. Not from fatigue but from the exhaustion of someone who had just had to stand firm against the old wind blowing back. She didn't cry. Not right now. She knew that if she cried it wouldn't be because of the man but because old memories had just been brought back to the surface. That evening Clara sat alone in her small room. She removed the silver hairpin from her hair and placed it on the table. The oil lamp cast a faint light on the old metal surface, causing it to reflect a weak glow. She recalled the moment in the square. She remembered the gazes of the people around her. She remembered the feeling of standing still without saying anything. And Clara realized something important. The silence today is unlike the silence of the past. In the past, she remained silent because she wasn't believed. Today, she remains silent because she no longer needs to be believed to know who she is. In Redstone Valley, Clara Whitmore built a life through hard work, through presence, and by not leaving. The insults, even public ones, could not destroy that. But she also knew the challenge wasn't over yet. When one person dares to insult her in public, others will dare to do the same, unless someone steps up to put an end to it, not with flowery words, but with the truth spoken at the right time. And Clara Whitmore had no idea that in the moment she stood motionless in Redstone Valley Square that day, a man had witnessed it all, and very soon he would choose to step forward, not to save her, but to say something this town had long needed to hear. Caleb Rourke is not someone who gets angry easily. His years living on the frontier had taught him that anger rarely solves anything. The land doesn't change because people are angry. Livestock don't become more docile because of shouting. And people, especially in small communities like Redstone Valley, will only close themselves off if forced. But there are moments when silence is no longer an option. Caleb heard about what had happened in the square that very afternoon. No one told the whole story. Everyone said a little. But he didn't need to hear the whole story. He just needed to hear that Clara Whitmore had been insulted in front of the crowd and that she had stood still, saying nothing. Caleb didn't ask Clara. He didn't go to the kitchen. He didn't look for her to confirm. He knew that if Clara wanted to speak, she would speak for herself. And if she didn't speak, it wasn't because she had nothing to say, but because she had chosen another way to preserve her dignity. But Caleb also knew something else. If this wasn't stopped, it would continue. In towns like Redstone Valley, rumors are like the wind. They can't be stopped, but they can be redirected if someone heavy enough stands in their way. A few days later, one morning, when everyone gathered in the square to hear the announcement about the water allocation for the upcoming dry season, Caleb Rourke appeared. He didn't arrive early. He didn't stand in the center. He stood slightly to the edge, as was his habit, like someone not seeking attention. An old coat, a wide-brimmed hat shielding him from the sun. He looked exactly the same as usual, and that's precisely what made his presence noticeable. Caleb didn't comment immediately. He waited for the exchanges to end. He waited for the crowd to quiet down. He waited for the moment when words, if spoken, would not be lost in the noise. Then he took a step forward. Just one step. No one asked him to speak. But when Caleb Rourke opened his mouth, those around him naturally fell silent. Not out of fear, but because they were used to him only speaking when it was absolutely necessary. "I want to say something," Caleb said, his voice low, not high. "About the people who work at Rourke Ranch. Don't call out names right away." Caleb wasn't in a hurry. "Someone in this town has been saying untrue things about Clara Whitmore." A very gentle wave spread through the crowd. No one objected. No one denied. There was only a quiet tension, the tension of those who knew they were about to face the truth, whether they wanted to or not. Caleb didn't look at the man who had insulted Clara. He didn't need to. He looked directly at the crowd. "I don't know what's happening in the East," he continued, "and I don't care." That statement made a few people frown. But Caleb didn't stop there. "I only know what I see, and what I see is this." He paused for a moment. "She came to Rourke Ranch asking for nothing. No special treatment. No request for any special circumstances. She worked like everyone else, from sunrise to sunset. No flowery language. No effusive emotion. Just simple sentences, but each sentence carries the weight of truth. I saw her stay when many others left. I saw her work when no one was looking. I saw her admit her mistakes when she did something wrong, and not boast when she did it right." Caleb looked around. "Here in the West," he said, his voice still, "we judge people by those things." The silence grew heavier. A few people began to nod very softly, not because they needed to be convinced, but because they realized Caleb was saying something they already knew but no one had dared to say out loud. Caleb continued, not raising his voice any further. "If anyone here thinks that rumors from elsewhere are more valuable than what one person has proven through hard work and character in Redstone Valley, then that person is saying that our own work is worthless." That statement fell like a stone. No one reacted immediately. But it touched upon something this community values most: the dignity of labor. Caleb concluded with a short sentence. "At Rourke Ranch, Clara Whitmore is one of us. And for me, that's enough." No applause, no cheers. No one stood up to object. Caleb didn't wait for a reaction. He stepped back to his original position as if nothing unusual had happened. But he knew, and so did the others, that a line had just been drawn. Clara Whitmore was not there. She was working in the kitchen as usual. When Mrs. Pike heard the story and recounted it, she didn't embellish it. She simply said that Caleb had spoken clearly, and the town had listened in silence. Clara remained silent for a very long time. She didn't feel rescued. She didn't feel like the center of attention. She just felt, for the first time since leaving Savannah, that there was a man who had used his authority to put the truth above the rumors. And he did it not out of pity, because that's the right thing to do. That evening, Clara and Caleb happened to be standing together in the yard. Neither mentioned what had happened in town. Neither said thank you. But between them, there was a deeper, unspoken understanding than before. Caleb didn't protect Clara because she was weak. He stood up for her because she was strong enough to deserve to stand with the truth. And in that moment, Clara Whitmore understood that some relationships are not built on promises or intense emotions, but on faith in how a person chooses to act when what is right is challenged. But Redstone Valley hasn't tested Clara Whitmore to the very end yet, for very soon. Not rumors or glances, but fire and survival will force her to prove not who she is, but how much she is willing to sacrifice for the place she began to call home. That summer arrived late, but when it did, Redstone Valley knew right away that it wouldn't be a pleasant one. The wind blew harder than usual. The ground was so dry that each step stirred up thin clouds of red dust. The weeds had turned a burnt yellow, brittle and sharp, ready to burst into flames with just a spark. Longtime residents of this valley all sensed it, a familiar, quiet, yet unmistakable feeling. Caleb Rourke reminded people to be more careful. Don't light fires indiscriminately. Don't leave embers outside. But nature doesn't always listen to human advice. The fire started on the western side of the valley, where the sparse forest bordered the dry grassland. Initially it was just a thin column of smoke rising against the pale blue sky, easily mistaken for dust. But by midday the wind changed direction, and the smoke became thicker and darker. When the alarm sounded at Rourke Ranch, everyone understood fire was approaching. No one panicked. In the West, panic only makes things worse. People moved quickly but in an orderly fashion. Livestock were herded to safer areas. Makeshift firefighting equipment was brought out. Large water tanks were dragged near important buildings. Clara Whitmore was in the kitchen when the smell of smoke filled the air. In that first moment her instincts, old instincts from the East, whispered leave. Fire is not something to test your strength in. No one will blame you if you run. You have no obligation to stay, no vows, no blood ties. But then Clara looked around the kitchen. She looked at the dark wooden tables weathered by time. She looked at the fire that had sustained the entire farm. She looked at the people moving around outside. No one ordered her, no one pulled her back, but they were all staying. And Clara understood one thing very clearly. This is the only place in the world where she won't be questioned about her past, and it's also the only place where her present has any value. She tied the scarf tightly around her head, rolled up her sleeves, and stepped outside. The fire spread faster than people expected. The wind swept the glowing red embers through the air like a relentless meteor shower. The air grew hotter, drier, and throat-stinging. The sounds of cracking wood, burning grass, and people calling out to each other echoed incessantly, yet without chaos. Caleb Rourke stood in the center of the field, giving instructions in short, concise sentences. He saw Clara. His gaze lingered for a very brief moment. He didn't tell her to leave. Nor did he tell her to stay. He simply nodded, as he would to anyone who had chosen to stand there. Clara was tasked with protecting the kitchen and food storage areas, along with Mrs. Pike and a few others. If these areas fell, Rourke Ranch would not be able to survive the coming winter, even if the fire were extinguished. The work is hard and dangerous. They passed water around, continuously pouring it onto the wooden walls, the roof, and the increasingly hot ground beneath their feet. The smoke stung their eyes. Each breath burned their throats. Clara felt her strength draining away rapidly, but she didn't stop. No one stopped. At one point the fire flared up very close. A section of the wooden fence began to catch fire. Clara and another worker rushed over, using their wet coats to put out the flames. The heat hit her face, making her dizzy. For a moment she thought she would fall, but she didn't fall. She thought of the early mornings, the nights of backaches, the days of being looked at with suspicion. All of those things somehow had prepared her for this moment, not to become a hero, but so as not to run away. Time lost its meaning amidst the smoke and flames. Only the rhythm of work remained, passing water, extinguishing fires, retreating, then advancing. Clara could no longer feel her hands. They were numb, moving by inertia and willpower. At one point she collapsed from exhaustion. Mrs. Pike pulled her up without saying a word. She simply handed her another bucket of water. Clara stood up. No one shouted, no one cheered. But among these people working themselves to exhaustion, there was a bond stronger than any words could express. Finally, when the wind subsided and the fire was contained at the northern edge of the farm, Redstone Valley remained standing. Not intact, but it's still there. The ground was blackened. The air reeked of ash. Several buildings were charred, but the kitchen, the food storehouse, and the livestock essential for survival remained safe. Clara sat down on the floor, her back against the still warm wooden wall. Her whole body trembled with exhaustion and the recent stress. She didn't cry. There were no more tears left to shed. Caleb Rourke walked past and stopped near her. He looked at Clara not with surprise nor with ostentatious gratitude. It was simply the profound recognition of someone who had seen her choose the hardest path. "You should take a break," he said. Clara nodded. But before closing her eyes she looked around. Rourke Ranch, a place of ash weariness but still alive. And in that moment, Clara Whitmore understood something she had never understood in her entire life. She didn't stay because she was asked to. She stayed because she chose this place. Fire has tested everything. But with Clara, it did something different. It completely burned away the part of her that had once thought of itself as merely transient. As dawn broke over Redstone Valley after the devastating night of fire, Clara Whitmore stood amidst the ashes and the new light, unaware that what remained to face was not a challenge or prejudice, but the simplest, most profound question of all time: where truly is home? After the fire, Redstone Valley was unusually quiet. It wasn't the tense silence of lurking danger, but the weary silence of people who had endured a night longer than they could bear. The ground was still warm. A thin layer of ash covered the grass and trees. The air smelled of burnt wood mixed with damp wood, the smell of survival, unpleasant but very real. Rourke Ranch is still standing there, not as intact as it once was, but strong enough to continue existing. The following days passed slowly. No one talked much about the fire. In Redstone Valley, people weren't in the habit of dwelling on the past, especially since everyone knew that if nature wanted to test them again, it wouldn't need any warning. Clara Whitmore returned to her daily routine after a short day off to recover. Her hands still ached. Her body was weary. But in each step there was a renewed steadiness, not from strength but from a clear sense of her place. She no longer felt like she was staying as a guest. "I no longer feel like I'm proving anything. She's simply here." Mrs. Eleanor Pike assigned Clara tasks, as always, no lighter, no heavier. But in subtle gestures, Clara noticed something had changed. A chair was pulled out. A portion of the work was left to her without instruction. Mrs. Pike was still strict, but that strictness now came with something else. Complete trust had been placed in her. Caleb Rourke made no mention of the night of the fire. He didn't say thank you either. One afternoon, as Clara was repairing the charred fence to the north, Caleb stopped nearby. He gave her a new hammer. Her old one had a cracked handle from fighting fires. "Use this," he said. "That's all." But Clara understood. In the East, crucial moments are often accompanied by lengthy speeches. In the Redstone Valley, a well-timed instrument spoke volumes. Days passed. Summer gradually faded. The wind carried the early chill of autumn. Rourke Ranch slowly recovered, unhurried, unpretentious, just as it had always done. And during that recovery, Clara began to notice something strange. She no longer thinks about leaving. That thought, which had been a silent companion in the early days, was now gone. Not because Clara was afraid of the outside world, but because she was no longer looking for anywhere else. One evening, when work finished earlier than usual, Clara stood on the porch watching the sunset spread across the valley. The sky was tinged with a soft orange, the light fading, not dazzling. It was a moment when Redstone Valley was at its most beautiful, unpretentious, unpromising, simply present. Caleb was standing not far away. They didn't stand next to each other right away. No rush. Their closeness was never something that needed to be forced. It found its own suitable distance. Caleb was the first to speak up. "Have you considered returning to the East?" he asked, his voice low and unscrupulous. Clara wasn't surprised. That question had to be asked, sooner or later, not as an offer, but as a door needing confirmation of whether it was closed or not. She was silent for a long time. It's not because it's difficult to answer. It's because she wants to answer as honestly as possible. "I've thought about it," Clara said. "Many times." Caleb nodded. He didn't press the matter. "But I realized," she continued, her voice soft, "that I didn't come here to be forgiven." Caleb turned to look at her. Clara didn't look at him. She gazed straight out at the valley where the light was fading. "I came here to belong," she said slowly. "I didn't come here to be forgiven. I came here to belong." The words fell into the quiet space, neither echoing nor dramatic, but they stayed. Caleb didn't answer immediately. He looked toward Rourke Ranch, the wooden houses, the granaries, the stables, all bearing the marks of time and having just survived a devastating fire. He knew all too well the value of someone who chose to stay, not out of obligation, but out of free choice. "Well then," he said after a moment, "you're in the right place. Not a promise, not an invitation. It's just an acknowledgement." Clara felt something in her heart settle down, as if a long journey had finally come to an end. Not because everything was perfect, but because she no longer needed to run. That night, Clara sat in her small room, opening the old box she had brought with her from Savannah. Inside were a few mementos of her mother, a silver brooch, an unfinished piece of embroidery, and an unsent letter. She touched each item, no longer feeling the sharp pain she had felt before. The past is still there, but it's no longer under her current control. Clara placed the silver brooch on the table, then smiled softly. Not a smile of victory, but a smile of peace. The next morning she woke up early as usual. The morning sun streamed into the valley. Rourke Ranch began a new day, nothing special, no events. But Clara knew that it was precisely these ordinary days that she had been searching for all these years. She stepped outside, taking a deep breath of the dry, cold air. A gentle breeze blew, carrying dust and sunlight. And for the first time in her life, Clara Whitmore no longer felt like she was in a strange place. She has gone home. There are people who don't need salvation, who don't need forgiveness. They just need a place large enough to live decently and patient enough to welcome them with action rather than judgment. And in that harsh frontier where the land doesn't question the past, Clara Whitmore found the simplest yet most precious thing in her life. A home built with labor, dignity, and the choice to stay. The story sent west as punishment. But the cowboy saw her as the greatest blessing of his life is more than just a Wild West love song. It's a gentle yet profound reminder of human dignity in moments of misunderstanding and abandonment. Clara Whitmore was not redeemed by an apology. She didn't wait for anyone to vindicate her. She simply chose to live a decent life, work hard, and not give up, even when the past came back to hurt her again. The biggest lesson here isn't be strong, but rather, your value doesn't come from others believing in you, but from not betraying yourself. Caleb Rourke is not a fairy tale hero either. He makes no promises. He doesn't save anyone from their fate. He simply stands for truth proven by action and dares to speak the truth when silence becomes complicity. For those viewers who have lived more than half their lives, this story reminds us that there are places that don't care who you used to be. They only care about what you do today. The most enduring relationships don't begin with passion, but with respect and trust. And sometimes home isn't where we're born, but where we're allowed to stay without having to justify our existence. If this story resonates with you even just a little, please like, share, and subscribe to our channel so we can continue telling slow, kind, and humane stories like this. Thank you for listening and for staying until the end.